The account of the Island of Númenor that here follows is derived from descriptions and simple maps that were long preserved in the archives of the kings of Gondor. These represent indeed but a small part of all that was once written, for many natural histories and geographies were composed by learned men in Númenor. But these, like nearly all else of the arts and sciences of Númenor at its high tide, disappeared in the downfall. Even such documents as were preserved in Gondor or in Imladris, where in the care of Elrond deposited the surviving treasures of the northern Númenorian kings, suffered from loss and destruction by neglect. For though the survivors in Middle-earth yearned, as they said, for Akallabeth, the downfallen, and never even after long ages ceased to regard themselves as in a measure exiles, when it became clear that the land of gift was taken away, and that Númenor had disappeared forever, all but a few regarded study of what was left of its history as vain, breeding only useless regret. The story of Ar-Pharazôn and his impious armada was all that remained generally known in later ages. The land of Númenor resembled in outline a five-pointed star, or pentangle, with a central portion some 250 miles across, north and south, and east and west, from which extended 5 large peninsular promontories. These promontories were regarded as separate regions, and they were named Forustar, Northlands, Understar, Westlands, Heranustar, Southwestlands, Hirostar, Southeastlands, and Orostar, Eastlands. The central portion was called Middlemar, Inlands, and it had no coast except the land about Romena and the head of its firth. A small part of the Middlemar was, however, separated from the rest and called Arandor, the king's land. In Arandor were the haven of Romena, the Meneltarma, and Armenolos, the city of the kings, and it was at all times the most populous region of Númenor. The Middlemar was raised above the promontories, not reckoning the height of the mountains and hills. It was a region of grasslands and low downs, and few trees grew there. Near to the centre of the Middlemar stood the tall mountain called Meneltarma, pillar of the heavens, sacred to the worship of Ilúvatar. Though the lower slopes of the mountain were gentle and grass-covered, it grew ever steeper, and towards the summit it could not be scaled, but a winding spiral road was made upon it, beginning at its foot upon the south, and ending below the lip of the summit upon the north. For the summit was somewhat flattened and depressed, and could contain a great multitude, but it remained untouched by hand throughout the history of Númenor. No building, no raised altar, not even a pile of undressed stones ever stood there, and no other likeness of a temple did the Númenorians possess in all the days of their grace, until the coming of Sauron. There no tool or weapon had ever been born, and there none might speak any word, save the king only. Thrice only in each year the king spoke, offering prayer for the coming year at the Erukjerme, in the first days of spring, praise of Ilúvatar at the Erulaitale in midsummer, and thanksgiving to him at the Eruhantale at the end of autumn. At these times the king ascended the mountain on foot, followed by a great concourse of the people, clad in white and garlanded, but silent. At other times the people were free to climb to the summit alone or in company, but it is said that the silence was so great that even a stranger ignorant of Númenor and all its history, if he were transported thither, would not have dared to speak aloud. No bird ever came there, save only eagles. If anyone approached the summit, at once 3 eagles would appear and alight upon 3 rocks near to the western edge. But at the times of the 3 prayers, they did not descend, remaining in the sky and hovering above the people. They were called the Witnesses of Manwe, and they were believed to be sent by him from Aman to keep watch upon the holy mountain and upon all the land. The base of the Meneltarma sloped gently into the surrounding plain, but it extended after the fashion of roots, 5 long low ridges outwards in the direction of the 5 promontories of the land, and these were called Tarmasundar, the roots of the pillar. Along the crest of the southwestern ridge the climbing road approached the mountain, and between this ridge and that on the southeast the land went down into a shallow valley. That was named Nuarinin, the Valley of the Tombs, for at its head chambers were cut in the rock at the base of the mountain, in which were the tombs of the kings and queens of Númenor. But for the most part the Meneltarma was a region of pastures. In the southwest there were rolling downs of grass, and there, in the Emeri, was the chief region of the shepherds. The Foresta was the least fertile part, stony, with few trees, save that on the westward slopes of the high heather-covered moors there were woods of fir and larch. Towards the North Cape the land rose to rocky heights, and there great Storontil rose sheer from the sea in tremendous cliffs. Here was the abode of many eagles, and in this region Tar Meneldur, Elentirmo, built a tall tower, from which he could observe the motions of the stars. The Understar was also rocky in its northern parts, with high fir woods looking out upon the sea. 3 small bays it had, facing west, cut back into the highlands, but here the cliffs were in many places not at the sea's edge, and there was a shelving land at their feet. The northmost of these was called the Bay of Andúnie, for there was the great haven of Andúnie, Sunset, with its town beside the shore, and many other dwellings climbing up the steep slopes behind. But much of the southerly part of the Understar was fertile, and there also were great woods of birch and beech upon the upper ground, and in the lower vales of oaks and elms. Between the promontories of the Understar and the Hiranastar was the great bay that was called Eldaena, because it faced towards Eresea, and the lands about it, being sheltered from the north and open to the western seas, were warm, and the most rain fell there. At the centre of the Bay of Eldaena was the most beautiful of all the havens of Númenor, Eldalonde, the Green, and hither in the earlier days the swift white ships of the Eldar of Eresea came most often. All about that place, up the seaward slopes and far into the land, grew the evergreen and fragrant trees that they brought out of the west, and so throve there that the Eldar said that almost it was fair as a haven in Eresea. They were the greatest delights of Númenor, and they were remembered in many songs long after they had perished for ever, for few ever flowered east of the land of gift. Oilare and Lyra Lose, Nesamelda, Vardariana, Taniquelase, and Yavanamere, with its globed and scarlet fruits. Flower, leaf, and rind of those trees exuded sweet scents, and all that country was full of blended fragrance. Therefore it was called Nisimalda, the fragrant trees. Many of them were planted and grew, though far less abundantly, in other regions of Númenor. But only here grew the mighty golden tree Malenorne, reaching after 5 centuries a height scarce less than it achieved in Eresea itself. Its bark was silver and smooth, and its boughs somewhat upswept after the manner of the beech, but it never grew save with a single trunk. Its leaves, like those of the beech but greater, were pale green above, and beneath were silver, glistering in the sun. In the autumn they did not fall, but turned to pale gold. In the spring it bore golden blossom and clusters like a cherry, which bloomed on during the summer, and as soon as the flowers opened, the leaves fell, so that through spring and summer a grove of Malenorne was carpeted and roofed with gold, but its pillars were of grey silver. Its fruit was a nut with a silver shale, and some were given as a gift by Tar Aldarion, the 6th king of Númenor, to King Gilgalad of Lindon. They did not take root in that land, but Gilgalad gave some to his kinswoman Galadriel, and under her power they grew and flourished in the guarded land of Lothlorien, beside the river Anduin, until the high elves at last left Middle-earth. But they did not reach the height or girth of the great groves of Númenor. The river Nunduin flowed into the sea at Eldalonde, and on its way made the little lake of Nisenen, that was so named from the abundance of sweet-smelling shrubs and flowers that grew upon its banks. The J.R.R. star was in its western part a mountainous region with great cliffs on the western and southern coasts, but eastwards were great vineyards in a warm and fertile land. The promontories of the J.R.R. star and the J.R.R. star were splayed wide apart, and on those long shores sea and land came gently together, as nowhere else in Númenor. Here flowed down Seafaring, the chief river of the land, for all others, save the Nonduine in the west, were short and swift torrents hurrying to the sea, that rose in springs under the Meneltarma, in the valley of Númenor, and running through the Middlemar southwards, became in its lower course a slow and winding stream. It issued at last into the sea amid wide marshes and reedy flats, and its many small mouths found their changing paths through great sands. For many miles on either side were wide, white beaches and grey shingles, and here the fisher-folk mostly dwelt in villages upon the hearths among the marshes and meres, of which the chief was Nindamos. In the J.R.R. star grew an abundance of trees of many kinds, and among them the larinque, in which the people delighted for its flowers, for it had no other use. This name they gave it because of its long hanging clusters of yellow flowers, and some who had heard from the Eldar of Ladolin, the golden tree of Valinor, believed that it came from that great tree, being brought in seed thither by the Eldar. But it was not so. From the days of Tar Alderion there were great plantations in the J.R.R. star to furnish timber for shipbuilding. The Orostar was a cooler land, but it was protected from the cold northeast winds by highlands that rose towards the end of the promontory, and in the inner regions of the Orostar much grain was grown, especially in those parts near to the borders of Arandor. The whole land of Númenor was so posed as if it had been thrust upward out of the sea, but tilted southward and a little eastward, and save upon the south, the land in nearly all places fell towards the sea in steep cliffs. In Númenor, birds that dwell near the sea, and swim or dive in it, abode in multitudes beyond reckoning. The mariners said that were they blind, they still would know that their ship was drawing near to Númenor, because of the great clamour of the birds of the shore. And when any ship approached the land, seabirds in great flocks would arise and fly above it in welcome and gladness, for they were never killed or molested by intent. Some would accompany ships on their voyages, even those that went to Middle-earth. Likewise, within the lands the birds of Númenor were beyond count, from the Kerinki, that were no bigger than wrens, but all scarlet with piping voices on the edge of human hearing, to the great eagles that were held sacred to Manwë, and never afflicted until the days of evil and the hatred of the Valar began. For 2,000 years, from the days of Elros Tar Minyatur until the time of Tar Ankalaman, son of Tar Atanamir, there was an eyrie in the summit of the tower of the king's palace in Armenolos, and there one pair ever dwelt and lived on the bounty of the king. In Númenor all journeyed from place to place on horseback, for in riding the Númenorians both men and women took delight, and all the people of the land loved horses, treating them honourably and housing them nobly. They were trained to hear and answer calls from a great distance, and it is said in old tales that where there was great love between men and women and their favourite steeds, they could be summoned at need by thought alone. Therefore the roads of Númenor were for the most part unpaved, made and tended for riding, since coaches and carriages were little used in the earlier centuries, and heavy cargoes were borne by sea. The chief and utmost ancient road, suitable for wheels, ran from the greatest port, Romena, in the east, to the royal city of Armenolos, and thence on to the valley of the Tombs and the Meneltarma, and this road was early extended to Ondosto, within the borders of the Forastar, and thence to Anduine in the west. Along it passed wains bearing stone from the northlands, that was most esteemed for building, and timber in which the westlands were rich. The Edain brought with them to Númenor the knowledge of many crafts, and many craftsmen who had learned from the Eldar, besides preserving law and traditions of their own. But they could bring with them few materials, save for the tools of their crafts, and for long all metals in Númenor were precious metals. They brought with them many treasures of gold and silver, and gems also, but they did not find these things in Númenor. They loved them for their beauty, and it was this love that first aroused in them cupidity. In later days, when they fell under the shadow and became proud and unjust in their dealings with lesser folk of Middle-earth. Of the elves of Eressia, in the days of their friendship, they had at times gifts of gold and silver and jewels, but such things were rare and prized in all the earlier centuries, until the power of the kings was spread to the coasts of the east. Some metals they found in Númenor, and as their cunning in mining and in smelting and smithying swiftly grew, things of iron and copper became common. Among the rites of the Edain were weaponsmiths, and they had with the teaching of the Noldor acquired great skill in the forging of swords, of axe-blades, and of spearheads and knives. Swords the guild of weaponsmiths still made for the preservation of the craft, though most of their labour was spent on the fashioning of tools for the use of peace. The king and most of the great chieftains possessed swords as heirlooms of their fathers, and at times they would still give a sword as a gift to their heirs. A new sword was made for the king's heir to be given to him on the day on which this title was conferred. But no man wore a sword in Númenor, and for long years few indeed were the weapons of warlike intent that were made in the land. Axes and spears and bows they had, and shooting with bows on foot and on horseback was the chief sport and pastime of the Númenorians. In later days, in the wars upon Middle-earth, it was the bows of the Númenorians that were most greatly feared. The men of the sea, it was said, send before them a great cloud, as a rain turned to serpents, or a black hail tipped with steel. And in those days the great cohorts of the king's archers used bows made of hollow steel, with black feathered arrows, a full ell long, from point to notch. But for long the crews of the great Númenorian ships came unarmed among the men of Middle-earth, and though they had axes and bows aboard for the felling of timber and the hunting for food upon wild shores owned by no man, they did not bear these when they sought out the men of the lands. It was indeed their grievance when the shadow crept along the coasts, and men whom they had befriended became afraid or hostile, that iron was used against them by those to whom they had revealed it. Beyond all other pursuits, the strong men of Númenor took delight in the sea, in swimming, in diving, or in small craft for contests of speed in rowing or sailing. The hardiest of the people were the fisher folk. Fish were abundant all about the coasts, and were at all times a chief source of food in Númenor, and all the towns where many people congregated were set by the shores. From the fisher folk were mostly drawn the mariners, who, as the years passed, grew greatly in importance and esteem. It is said that when the Edain first set sail upon the great sea, following the star to Númenor, the elvish ships that bore them were each steered and captained by one of the Eldar deputed by Círdan. And after the elvish steersmen departed and took with them the most part of their ships, it was long before the Númenorians themselves ventured far to sea. But there were shipwrights among them who had been instructed by the Eldar, and by their own study and devices they improved their art until they dared to sail ever further into the deep waters. When 600 years had passed from the beginning of the Second Age, Veiontor, captain of the king's ships under Tar Elendil, first achieved the voyage to Middle-earth. He brought his ship Entulurse, which signifies return, into Mithlond, on the spring winds blowing from the west, and he returned in the autumn of the following year. Thereafter seafaring became the chief enterprise for daring and hardihood among the men of Númenor. And Uldarion, son of Meneltar, whose wife was Verentor's daughter, formed the Guild of Venturers, in which were joined all the tried mariners of Númenor, as is told in the tale that follows here.